They counted him as property. Years later, he counted more money than they ever had. Once his name was written in a ledger under assets. Later, theirs would appear under debts. He had worked their fields. He had built their wealth. He had listened while they spoke of him as if he were nothing more than muscle and bone. But while they measured cotton and profit, he was measuring opportunity. They thought freedom would be enough for him. They were wrong. Because the day he returned, not as labor, not as property, but as a man with contracts, land, and influence, their laughter stopped. The former masters who once owned his body now faced something they never imagined, a man they underestimated, holding more power than they ever did. This is the story of the slave who didn't just win freedom. He won the game they thought only they could play. His name was Kofi, but that was not what they called him when they brought him to the Beaumont plantation in the Sceaux, summer of 1833. They called him Lot 12 because he was the 12th man sold at auction that day in Charleston. And to his buyers, he was nothing more than a number in a ledger, a line item between a mule and a cotton press. He was 22 years old. He had walked upright off the ship from the Gold Coast with a posture that alarmed the auctioneer, so they made him bend his head. He did it with the ease of a man performing a trick he has no belief in, going through the motions to preserve a larger strategy he had not yet formed. That quality, that particular patience, would become the instrument of everything that followed. The Beaumont plantation covered 4,000 acres of the South Carolina low country. Cotton stretched to the tree line on 3 sides. The 4th side was a slow river the color of dark tea. Running the enterprise were 2 brothers, Harlan Beaumont, 48, who managed the land, and Clement Beaumont, 43, who managed the money. They were not cruel men in any theatrical sense. They did not enjoy causing pain. They were, which was perhaps worse, indifferent. They owned people the way they owned tools, with the quiet assumption that ownership required no justification. Kofi was assigned to the mill. His job was to keep a mental accounting of the cotton weights as they came in from the fields each day, because the scale had a tendency to stick, and the foreman, a red-faced man named Garvey, could not do sums in his head fast enough to keep pace with the harvest. Kofi could. He had learned numbers as a boy from an Arab merchant who traded along the coast, and he had a gift that was something between memory and intuition. He could hold figures in his mind the way other men held tools in their hands, naturally, without effort, without the sense that anything was being gripped. What Garvey did not know, what none of them knew, was that Kofi could also read. It happened 3 months into his time at the mill. Clement Beaumont left his estate ledger on the counting table when he was called away suddenly to deal with a horse that had gone lame. He was gone perhaps 20 minutes. Kofi stood at the table for a long moment. Then he read. The ledger was not in itself remarkable. It was the standard record of a mid-sized plantation, expenses in one column, income in another, debt to a factor in Charleston running down a third. But Kofi read it the way a physician reads a body, looking not at what was present, but at what the numbers implied about the condition underneath. And what he found was a slow bleeding. The Beaumonts were losing money. Not dramatically, not in the fashion that ends in ruin all at once, but in the steady, patient fashion of a leak in the hull of a ship. A little more water each season, the vessel sitting a little lower, the crew bailing without understanding what they were fighting. The cotton yields had peaked 4 years ago and were declining. The soil was exhausted, but the brothers were still investing as if the peak years would return, borrowing against a future the land could no longer promise. Kofi replaced the ledger exactly as he had found it. He went back to his weights, but something had shifted inside him, the way a key shifts in a lock that has not been opened in a long time. He began to observe everything, not with the furtive anxiety of a man afraid of being caught, but with the calm attention of a man who is conducting research. He watched how cotton was graded at the factor's warehouse in town, when the brothers sent him along with deliveries. He listened to the conversations between Clement and the factor, a wiry man named Price, who smelled of tobacco and dressed in a fashion that was 10 years behind Charleston. And he began to understand the mechanics of the cotton trade, how the price moved with the Liverpool market, how the factor took his percentage, how credit was extended and at what cost. He asked no questions. He simply listened. He carried cotton bales and listened. He held the horses and listened. He swept the counting room, which Clement used twice a week when he visited the mill. And he listened through the wall. He learned, over the course of 2 years, the complete financial anatomy of the Beaumont operation. And having learned it, he formulated a thought so audacious that he kept it behind his eyes for 6 months before he allowed himself to fully examine it. He could fix it. In the winter of 1836, Kofi requested a meeting with Clement Beaumont. He made the request through Garvey, who thought it was the funniest thing he had heard in some time, and repeated it to Clement with a laugh. Clement, out of curiosity more than anything else, agreed. They met in the counting room. Clement sat behind the desk. Kofi stood. Clement folded his hands and waited with the expression of a man indulging something harmless. Kofi said, "Your yield is down 18% over 4 years. The soil on the West Fields is depleted. You're paying price 9% when the going rate has dropped to 7. Your seed costs are 30% above what Collins at the Marsh Farm pays, because you're ordering from the same Charleston supplier you used in 1825. And you have $14,000 in revolving debt at 6% that you could retire in 2 seasons if you shifted 40 acres from cotton to indigo, which the French buyers are paying a premium for because the Indian supply has been disrupted." The room was quiet. Clement stared at him with an expression that had moved in the space of about 30 seconds through amusement, surprise, alarm, and arrived somewhere that did not quite have a name yet. He said, "Where did you learn to read?" Kofi said, "I always knew how to read." "And the ledger?" "I looked at it when you left it on the table." Clement should have been furious. By the logic of the world he inhabited, the correct response was punishment, swift, exemplary, and harsh enough to discourage the notion that a slave could read his master's accounts and present himself as a financial advisor. But Clement Beaumont was, above everything, a man who understood money, and the figure $14,000 was sitting in the room between them like a stone in a river, undeniable and immovable. He said, "What do you want?" Kofi said, "I want a ledger of my own. I want to be permitted to conduct small trades on my own account, seeds, goods, what the other workers need that the plantation doesn't provide. I want to keep what I earn above a sum I'll pay to you each month, and I want it written down and signed." Clement Beaumont looked at him for a long time. Outside, The winter light came through the counting room window at a low angle and laid a bar of gold across the floor between them. He said, "You're an extraordinary damn fool. You know that?" "I've been called worse," Kofi said. They spent 2 more hours negotiating. Kofi had prepared for this. He knew Clement's price before Clement did. He walked out of the counting room with a contract, a formal paper that Clement signed and Kofi signed, which gave Kofi the right to trade on his own account, to keep his own records, and to retain 60% of whatever he earned above a fixed monthly payment. It was not freedom, but it was leverage. And leverage, as Kofi had come to understand, was the beginning of all things. He started with seeds. There was a simple problem on the Beaumont plantation, as on most plantations. The workers needed things the plantation store did not carry, or carried only at prices so inflated they constituted a second form of bondage. Kofi began buying in bulk, seeds for kitchen gardens, medicinal herbs, needles and thread, the small tools of domestic survival, and selling them at fair prices to the people around him. He kept meticulous accounts in a small notebook that he carried in his shirt. Within 6 months, he had a profit. It was modest, barely enough to buy a second notebook, but it was a proof of principle. He reinvested it entirely. In the second year, he extended his operation to 3 neighboring plantations, traveling with the cotton deliveries and conducting his side business with the careful efficiency of a man who knew he was always working within a margin of tolerance. He was useful to too many people to be easily shut down. The overseers looked the other way. Some of them quietly were customers. In the 3rd year, he did something that astonished even himself. He loaned money. A free black carpenter named Isaiah Webb, who lived in the town 8 miles from the plantation, needed capital to buy his tools back from a white creditor who was calling in the debt. He had nowhere to turn. The local banks would not lend to him. He came to Kofi through a chain of whispered referrals, the way people in need always find the ones who can help them. Kofi lent him the money at a rate lower than any bank in South Carolina would have offered a white man of similar creditworthiness. Isaiah Webb paid it back in 8 months. Then he sent 3 more men who needed money. Kofi lent to them too. He charged fair rates and enforced his contracts through reputation rather than law, which was, in any case, a system that did not recognize his right to enforce anything. By the end of 1840, 7 years after arriving at the Beaumont plantation as Lot 12, Kofi had accumulated $3,200 in capital, held not in a bank, which would not have accepted his deposit, but in land purchased in the name of Isaiah Webb, in goods, and in outstanding loans that Webb managed as his silent agent. The Beaumonts, meanwhile, were still bleeding. Clement had followed Kofi's advice about the indigo, and it had helped. He had retired the revolving debt and stabilized the operation. But the fundamental problem of the exhausted soil remained, and Clement had neither the vision nor the capital to address it properly. Harlan died of fever in 1839. Clement was running the plantation alone now, spending more time in Charleston than on the land, and the management was suffering. In 1841, Clement came to Kofi. This time, it was Clement who requested the meeting. This time, it was Clement who had a proposition. The proposition was this. Clement needed $4,000 to make improvements to the east fields, drainage systems that would slow the soil degradation and potentially recover yield. He could not get the money from his Charleston factor without surrendering an equity stake in the plantation that he was not willing to surrender. He could not get it from the banks without mortgaging land he had already leveraged. He said, "I know what you have, Kofi, or near enough." Kofi said nothing. He waited. "I want a loan." Kofi looked at him for a long moment. It was not the same look he had given Clement at their first meeting. Not the look of a man presenting himself as useful. It was the look of a man evaluating a debtor. He said, "What security are you offering?" What followed was the strangest negotiation in the history of that, or possibly any South Carolina county. Clement Beaumont, who legally owned Kofi, sat across a table from Kofi and negotiated the terms of a loan in which Kofi's money would fund Clement's land. The security offered was complex and necessarily informal. A legal arrangement of the kind that required Isaiah Webb's name at several points. But it was real, and it was enforceable in the ways that mattered, through the networks of reputation and mutual dependence that had come to govern Kofi's world. Kofi lent the money. He lent it at 4%, below the market rate for a borrower of Clement's risk profile, because there was something else Kofi wanted, and he was paying for it with a lower interest rate. He wanted his papers, his freedom papers. Clement was quiet for a long time after that. They each so. Afternoon deepened around them. A slave with $4,000 in capital was asking to be freed in exchange for lending that capital to the man who owned him. It was not, on the face of it, a transaction that made any conventional sense. But Clement Beaumont had spent years watching Kofi do things that made no conventional sense, and then watching them work. He said, "You'll go north." Kofi said, "No, I'll stay." Clement looked up. That surprised him more than anything else. "I have business here," Kofi said. "People I've lent to, people who depend on the arrangements we have. I'm not going anywhere." The papers were signed in March of 1842. Kofi walked out of the Beaumont plantation office a free man. He had been Lot 12 when he arrived. He had no last name on the papers. This was common. And so he chose one himself, standing in the road outside the gate, with the papers in his hand and the sun coming down through the pine trees. He chose the name Worth. He stayed. That surprised people more than anything else. That Kofi Worth, having obtained his freedom, did not move to Philadelphia or Cincinnati or any of the cities that were gathering free black Americans into their northern neighborhoods. He stayed in South Carolina. He rented a small house in town, and he expanded. By 1845, his lending operation, still formally run through Isaiah Webb because the law required it, had outstanding loans totaling $11,000. He had financed the establishment of a cooperage, a millinery shop, a small ferry operation on the tea-colored river, and a school. The school was his particular pride. It was technically a church school run by a minister who was one of his borrowers, and it taught approximately 30 children to read and do arithmetic. Kofi taught there himself, twice a week, in the evenings. The Beaumont plantation, meanwhile, was in its final years. Clement had used the drainage loan well. The east fields had recovered somewhat. So, but the overall direction of the land could not be reversed by $4,000 and good intentions. The cotton market had shifted. The soil had a memory of its abuse that no drainage system could entirely erase. In 1847, Clement sold the western acreage to a neighboring estate. In 1849, he sold the mill. He sold the mill to a holding company. The holding company had been incorporated by Isaiah Webb as agent for Kofi Worth. It was not done as an act of humiliation. Kofi had no interest in humiliation. He bought the mill because it was a good mill, because it sat at the center of a network of agricultural relationships he had been mapping for 15 years, and because the price was fair and the deal made sense. He paid Clement Beaumont $7,000 for the property, which was $2,000 more than the next highest offer. Clement knew who was buying it. He took the money without comment. They shook hands. It was, in its way, a more civilized transaction than most of the ones that had defined the relationship between the South Carolina planting class and the people it had enslaved, which was not admittedly a high bar, but it was something. By 1855, Kofi Worth's holdings, his loans, his properties, his share of the businesses he had financed, were assessed by Isaiah Webb's meticulous accounting at just under $40,000. Clement Beaumont, who had once owned him, was worth perhaps $12,000. People came to him for advice the way they had always come to him, through whispered referrals, through chains of need, and he gave it with the same patience he had brought to everything else. He was not a warm man in the conventional sense. He did not make speeches or seek followers. He was simply the person in the room who had read the most ledgers and who understood, better than almost anyone else in that part of the state, that money was not a thing but a language, a system of communicating about value, trust, and time. He sometimes thought about the afternoon in the counting room when he had first read Clement's ledger. The 20 minutes while the horse was being tended and the window let in the thin winter light. He thought about what it had felt like to see the numbers and understand immediately what they meant, the way you understand a sentence in a language you have spoken since childhood. He had been a slave with a number instead of a name, and he had read those numbers and seen in them, as clearly as anything he had ever seen, the outline of a path. He had not been without fear. That was important to remember, and he thought about it honestly. He had been afraid for almost every year of the journey. Afraid when he read the ledger, afraid when he walked into the counting room, afraid when he lent his money to Isaiah Webb to hold, afraid when he lent to Clement, afraid when he signed his name to the deed of the mill. Fear had not been absent from any of it. It had simply been less heavy than the alternative. The alternative was the permanent, airless weight of a life defined entirely by what other people decided you were worth. He had decided his own worth. That was the whole of the story.